catalogs. At this moment, many of my colleagues at the museum are connecting with one another through our desktop computers, our laptops, our phones, and our tablets. And the idea for this program is to use these same technologies that we are using, and obviously many of you are as well, to connect with all of you, our broader museum community. Each week, two invited guests from the museum staff will discuss a handful of works from the collection that resonate with and reflect the new world that many of us are living in. And this week, we're going to look at the ways two artists, José Guadalupe Posada and León Ferrari, have used the medium of printmaking to communicate across distances, much like we are doing right now. Their work is in the CMA exhibition, A Graphic Revolution, Prints and Drawings in Latin America. A few notes about the format. We will have a conversation for about 5 to 10 minutes about one work of art, and then open up to questions from you, our audience, for about 5 minutes. And then we'll move on to the next work, which will be followed by more of your questions. Now to introduce this afternoon's guests. And I just ask you to wave or, gesticulate wildly when I say your name. First, Britany Salsbury, who's the Associate Curator of Prints and Drawings at CMA and Curator of a Graphic Revolution. Welcome, Britany.
Thank you.
Right. And then Arielle Levine, who is the master teacher in the Department of Public and Academic Engagement, and she's also the lead teacher of CMA's distance learning program. So those of you who might have already been connecting with the museum remotely, Arielle, you probably have gotten to know her very well. So thank you for joining us, Arielle.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Now, I just want to introduce you to our first work of art. So I also want to make sure that all of you can also look along with us. I'm going to post a link right now to the title of this work of art, which also has a link to the CMA website, and it's by José Guadalupe Posada. The title in his native Spanish is La Calavera de los Camiones, and that roughly translates to the skeleton of the buses. It was made somewhere between 1900 and 1910. Posada was a very influential Mexican printmaker, active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and his satirical illustrations regularly critiqued the government and Mexican society. Britany, I'd like to ask you first, why did Posada make this print, La Calavera de los Camiones, or Skeleton of the Buses? Could you tell us what it's about, and why? And also, why did he turn to the medium of printmaking? What did it allow him?
Sure, those are all great questions about Posada. As you mentioned, he was an incredibly important artist in the history of Mexican printmaking. He's widely considered like the first modern Mexican artist, and he was a huge influence on artists that worked. Almost all of the artists who worked in printmaking after him. And Posada is known for developing this really style of prints, which is what you're seeing here, where there's usually an image at the top and then a big block of text at the bottom. And so this really exemplifies what his work looked like during the late 19th and early 20th century. And he almost always took his subjects from contemporary events. And he would usually look for stories that were especially sensational or a little bit ridiculous. So, just like today, people wanted to be entertained by the news. So this is the sort of content that he often featured in his prints. And so what we're looking at in this particular print is a particularly grim scene, and where we're seeing a streetcar full of skeletons that is pulling up into a what appears to be a graveyard. And so electric tram. These were a brand new invention in Mexico City, where Posada was living and working at the time. And he's not being particularly subtle about letting us know how he feels about this new technology. So death is literally one of the stops that the tram is making along its route. And you asked about why he turned to printmaking. Posada was one of many artists throughout art history who valued printmaking because it was so democratic. And printmaking is different from most other art making techniques in that prints exist in multiple. And so they're different from, a painting, which is just a single thing hanging on the wall. So copies of this print were made and circulated to as broad of an audience as possible. And Posada had actually trained as a commercial lithographer. And so this is like a very cheap, inexpensive technique that's centered on making as many things as possible, as cheaply as possible.
And I also, I also noticed that the paper is quite, the paper kind of also is kind of interesting. It's sort of yellowish and maybe brittle in person.
Yeah, I mean, going along with this whole idea of making as many things as he could, as cheaply as he could, he often used really inexpensive papers. So like what we're seeing here, it's like roughly equivalent to like newsprint today. So it doesn't stand the test of time.
No, it does not.
But yeah.
Right. Thank you, Britany. Now, Arielle, this is not the only Posada print to feature this sort of motif of the calavera or the skeleton. It's something that became, he became synonymous with. Why did he use this particular motif so much?
That's a great question. He definitely featured skeletons in a lot of his work, and it is very much what he became known for. They're referred to, much like this one, they're referred to as calaveras, which does mean skull, but it's also used to refer to his caricatures and even to the writing that's done, usually to accompany the illustrations. Besides the one that we have in our collection, we have to show everybody today another famous example of his work that is not from the CMA. This particular image is thought to be, I think, one of his very first calaveras, and it's from the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Also, probably from around 1910. The title of it is La Catrina, and it was meant to be, again, a skeleton illustration, but she's wearing an elaborate flowered hat. And it's supposed to be a portrait of a wealthy lady at that time. So La Catrina is sometimes described as a female dandy, is one way they translate it. But, in keeping with what he did with these works, he used them to criticize different issues in society, different groups of people. So one aspect of this is his criticism of the wealthy, that he was being very satirical, but he was trying to show that they sort of denied their Mexican heritage in some ways, that some of the wealthy chose to adopt European dress and customs, and just sort of the idea that the wealthy, the social classes obviously were, pretty separated at that point, but that they sort of saw themselves as a complete separation from the lower classes, that they were better than everybody else. So people sort of followed his lead and started using these calavera illustrations. People started creating their own after Posada's work, and they still use them today for Dia de los Muertos, or Day of the Dead, to make fun of famous figures in society, to criticize things that are going on in current events. And it's done with humor, but it's a way to point out real serious issues, as with a lot of kinds of satire.
No, actually, I know we can talk more about that, and we will, but we have some great questions. So I think I will ask, and let's approach those. We have a great question from Niels, who asks, was this work produced as a piece of art, or was it made more like a handbill for public distribution? Britany, would you care to answer that question?
Yeah, Arielle, good question. And I'm really glad we got that as a question, because it actually, and obviously it has an artistic function. Posada is going through the trouble of making a creative image, but he didn't intend it, I think, in his own to be, he didn't think of it as the same way that we think of it today. We have it literally hanging on the walls of the museum right now, but he saw it as something more ephemeral, to be handed out. I mean, it relates to something that happened on a specific, it's very tied to a particular time and place. And because it existed in so many copies, I think it's been handed out more broadly in that way, rather than purchased by a collector and stored away in a collection. Although it did, eventually, as it grew more popular, people certainly have collected his work in way. But I mean, that also explains this juxtaposition between the image and the text. He's trying to give it this like very functional purpose. Like he's communicating to both people who can and can't read, which there were many people who were illiterate in Mexico City during the early 20th century. And so he would have communicated across distances to quote our title with them well.
Arielle, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Just, I would definitely agree that it was definitely meant to be more ephemeral, and that is something that happens a lot in the art world. Like our recent exhibition about Michelangelo's sketches, like artist private thoughts sometimes end up being considered fine artwork.
It's a great example.
Yeah.
I think we especially get that in prints and drawings. I think you get that even more than other media, which is one of the reasons they're so great.
Totally. It's very exciting. You get to really sort of kind of re-see these things, in another way. We have another question from Steph, and I think we addressed this a little bit, but we can maybe expand on it. And this is for Britany, but again, Arielle, you should definitely chime in after, because Arielle knows about like everything in the collection. But can you speak to the importance of materials for audience accessibility in printmaking? We talked about the process he used and the multiple and the sort of cheap paper, but is there anything else that it's a really good question, because the technique that Posada is using is sort of unusual. As I mentioned, he trained as a commercial lithographer, which was about the most industrially produced sort of printmaking you could make at the time, but that wasn't enough for him, and so he experimented with lots of different printmaking techniques in order to find ways to print as many copies of his work as possible. And so what he's using here is actually a technique called relief etching, which is pretty unusual. He's using that for the image. And it was a technique that was invented centuries before, actually, by the British artist William Blake, but not many artists had used it between those periods of time. And so he made the image with relief etching, and then he made the text with a technique called letterpress. And what that let him do was actually recycle the images and substitute different captions sometimes for the image, substitute different blocks of text. And so he could rethink his images, reuse them. And Arielle actually found a great another impression of this print, where Posada had used this same image to illustrate a totally different news story, which I think is kind of amazing, because how many stories can this very striking image possibly apply to? But he managed to recycle it. Yeah, it makes me think
he's really using he's using the techniques that he has to make his work accessible to a different variety of audiences.
Yeah, it makes me think of it almost like how I know photography a little bit better than print history, but how photos will get recycled or reused in slightly different ways to communicate different things. And I guess this is also how newspapers worked at the time too, right? You would sort of arrange your blocks of text. Arielle, would you care to? We have one more question. Would you care to add to that in any way? Is there about this idea of accessibility, audience accessibility?
I think just as we were saying, that it was the idea that the image could speak as loudly as the text is part of what makes it so accessible to people too. The idea that even if you were not literate at that point, that the image, that whole idea of an image speaks louder than words. So I think he really tried to make sure that both were relevant for the audience that he was working with.
Definitely. And we have one more question, which I think would be great to answer from actually our colleague Sue Berg, who has a great question about Posada and pre-Columbian traditions. To what extent does Posada draw from pre-Columbian traditions in his art?
I feel like Sue could probably answer this question explaining pre-Columbian art, but I guess I'll just say that Posada worked. He was working both prior, right up until the Mexican Revolution, and so Arielle, the tension that there was there between in his work sometimes between indigenous and non-indigenous culture And I think that's one thing that he referenced again and again, and is that idea, the importance of pre-Columbian culture. And that's one of the big things that that later artists took from him, and one of the big questions that they grappled with in their work over the next couple of decades.
Yeah. I've never heard anyone say specifically, like, if he was really inspired by a particular pre-Columbian tradition or art form. But if you look at, images that have references to death and the spirit world in some ways, like, I think it's easy to see how it could have shaped some of his work. And as an artist living at that time, that wouldn't surprise me at all. I think it's an interesting comparison.
Well, I think for the sake of time, and we have lots of great questions, and I don't want to prevent from asking, but why don't we move on to our second work, and then we could always return to other questions. So I apologize to those of you that we didn't get to. I hope you understand. But thank you for your enthusiasm. And maybe we can get to them at the end. So just to let's move maybe further. Well, let's move further into the 20th century, and let's take a look at León Ferrari's print, which is from the Heliograph series entitled Square. Let me pop in, if that's okay, the link to the CMA website, so all of you can see it there on your own if you care to, in addition to what we're showing here. And this print was made in 1982. Now, if I'm correct, like Britany, right? Ferrari was an Argentinian artist, and he made this particular print while exiled in Brazil. And if I'm correct, and he wasn't like necessarily known for printmaking either, so that's kind of interesting, right? And he left his homeland because of the extreme repression of the military dictatorship in Argentina. And that's where he made this print. Now, politics maybe aside, though it's hard to not think about them with this work or Ferrari, what was it about this artist's work that really spoke to you in this current situation? It was something that you had entered the collection before all of this happened, right? But now what's particularly resonant today?
Yeah. No, I mean, one of the things that starting this work is pretty perfect for the current moment. I mean, Ferrari's doing a lot of where many of us are trying to do today. He's stuck in one place, and he's trying to communicate and getting creative in the way that he communicates with his friends who are, in an entirely different place. And so, as Andrew mentioned, he's an Argentinian artist. He worked for much of the 20th century, and he's especially known for his work from the 60s forward. And he actually, before becoming a professional artist, he had a career as an engineer. And so the printmaking technique that he's using here, many of the things that we can see about it actually relate to his former work. And that's because he's using a technique called diazotype. And it's not a common printmaking technique at all. This is the first diazotype that I had ever seen in my professional career as a print curator. So it's not a typical printmaking technique. It is typically used to make by engineers and architects to make blueprints. And so that explains the color. He's sort of working with what he has available to him at the moment. And what we're seeing is a view of a public square in Sao Paulo in Brazil, where he was living in exile. He was a very political artist, as we mentioned. And as a dictatorship took control in Brazil, he went and lived in exile. His work was especially, inflammatory. And so he thought it would be best to work somewhere else for about a decade. And so he's showing an aerial view of the city where everyone's sort of walking in their assigned path to to their own little square, and showing this very regular pattern of daily life. And I think one of the things that's so great about his work for the current moment is that throughout his entire career, he worked in all different media, but there's always this sort of interest in communication. And I think we actually have an image of a drawing, and that's also in A Graphic Revolution, that we might be able to look at. He made a whole series of drawings that were meant to suggest handwritten letters. So Yeah, you're seeing it there. And so here he's making it look like a handwritten letter. It looks like something we should be able to read, but more closely, the text is actually illegible, and so he's frustrating our experience as viewers in the same way that he was frustrated as an artist under this repressive dictatorship that enacted censorship upon him. So I think the desire to communicate is really relevant right now.
No, completely. And it's so interesting to see these him kind of making, developing solutions to communicate. And then also in this drawing that we're looking at now, frustrating communication. So it's like he's almost kind of talking about maybe his own situation, but then also thinking of ways he can reconnect, if that makes sense.
Right.
Arielle, so many museum goers are used to thinking of an artwork as a finely made painting, oil on canvas, on a panel, or something that's really masterfully produced, or of a fine material like bronze or marble. What do you find intriguing and artful in Ferrari's work? We're looking at something that could have been and was popped into the mail, maybe slipped into an envelope, something that reminds us of a letter, right? Which would have been a very common form of communication, right? What do you find artful about that in particular?
I found a lot of things really artful and intriguing about this print. And I really like the way that it relates to what we were talking about with Posada's work too, the idea that it was something with Posada's work that they were ephemeral. They weren't necessarily something that he thought of as a piece of fine art to be preserved. And I could see Ferrari's work maybe being looked at that way too, that this was something personal that he was using to communicate. Definitely the way that it was printed is pretty interesting, even if it's not what people think of when they think of like a fine art painting or sculpture or something with that kind of permanence. I was kind of intrigued by not only the printing process, the diazotype, but also the title of it and how it's been interpreted. The heliograph title is a reference to almost like doing a form of Morse code. It was a way of signaling people using light and using a mirror to kind of interrupt the reflection of the light. So used at first, in military communication, but that idea of, trying to send someone a long distance message, it made me think of, kids using tin can telephones or, kind of communicating. And right now just waving at people across the street and not being able to communicate closely, or leaving people things outside their door because we're trying to be socially distanced, making chalk drawings for people on their driveways. So I like that idea, but I also like that this print, when you read about some people's interpretations of it, that it's not only a view of a city grid, but that it might also talk about people sort of being confined and sort of going in a loop where you're not questioning the path that you're taking. Not only that society is kind of crazy like that, but also that at the time that he was living in, that people allowed injustice to continue. They chose to ignore some of the things that were happening. And I also like that relates to Posada, that both of them want people to pay attention and not just turn a blind eye to things that are going on. We could really relate that to a lot of issues we have today.
Yeah, and actually, to just turn to a question about this, about the Ferrari print from Steph, I think draws upon this interpretation. Steph asks, what is the significance of the square shape? Is it speaking to the structured experience of living in the city? And then I guess, Arielle, if you could continue, like, how does that, what you're thinking in terms of today, how does that have a new resonance today?
Well, I think you could look at it from the idea of, a blueprint or like a city grid, that you're seeing the plan of a city and how everything is sort of boxed and planned out. But I think for today, people also feel like they're confined to their individual living space too, that everybody sort of has their own area that you're allowed to move about, but you wish that you could move more freely. One of the interpretations that I read of it too talked about just what goes on behind the scenes, keep cities running and moving, and just that it might look like it's kind of absurd, but that chaos was necessary to sort of keep things functioning.
Britany, is there anything you care to add?
Yeah, and also, just like, I guess in a different way, but sort of similar today, Ferrari's living, at the time he made this print, he's living at this time of great social upheaval. everything around him, it's just probably felt like it was falling apart. So I wonder if there's that he's trying to make between the order of the regularity and sort of the craziness of not being able to control his, like, what's going on in the world around him in any way. I think it kind of that really strict order in the print could go either way. And I think that's one of the things that's great about it, is that it's so open to interpretation, like a lot of his work.
Yeah, like it looks organized on the surface, but behind the organization could be chaos.
Yeah.
Anyway, we can talk about how that relates to today another time. But this is I want to first of all, we have a great comment that I'd like to read, and I think we have more questions coming in. But this is not from an anonymous person, not a question, a statement. But it has to do with this last question that Arielle was answering about artfulness. I think the artfulness of these objects can be found in regarding them as relics of a time, not the propaganda of a regime or the narrative of a revolution, but the intimate insight that can be given by an ordinary object, and how it speaks to how average people lived and were affected by dramatic historic events. That's really very eloquent. Thank you, anonymous person. That's really great. It's really nice to hear your thoughts. Okay, I think we have some more.
And I know there were a couple questions about Posada if we have time to circle back to him.
Maybe. Why don't we pass on? This is a great question from another anonymous person. Maybe if we could put up the Posada image, that'd be great. What was Posada's apprehension about the new technology that death should be a stop on the trolley ride? What other stops would be included if you took an educated guess? Should this work to be extended to include more stops? Like, what other things, I guess, would he be sort of saying are dangerous, of that time? And an educated guess. I think that's a really great question.
I guess I always, when I look at this print, imagine this as the last stop, like in the trolley is making. I guess it's interesting to consider that there could be stops beyond this. But I think from what I've read, and I'm totally going to crib from earlier discussions with Arielle about the technology. It seems like it was the electric tram was widely viewed as dangerous at the time, and Arielle had found that it was actually, this is the same kind of technology that was, if you're familiar with the artist Frida Kahlo, she was in a terrible accident. With an electric tram. So there does seem to be, he's picking up, I think, on an idea that's circulating more broadly and using it as a conversational point. But Arielle, did you have other?
I was thinking about that, just the criticism of new technologies in general. Like when he reused this print to criticize just people's fascination with electricity, that, anything related to that era, and thinking about the Industrial Revolution, that everybody becomes sort of obsessed with things being mechanized in some way or another, that maybe it could have other stops that visit other kinds of new technology. But yeah, when I think of this one, I do always think about Frida Kahlo. She was injured in an accident in 1925, and it's another way actually to connect back to Posada's work. If people are interested, I can put this in the chat later. Frida Kahlo married Diego Rivera, who was also highly influenced by Posada's work. And Diego Rivera painted a mural that's in Mexico City, where you can see an image of José Posada, the artist, walking hand in hand with the skeleton of La Catrina. And then Frida Kahlo and Rivera himself are pictured in the mural as well. So it's so many interesting connections.
Yes.
I'll pop it in the announcements for the Q&A so people can see a link to that mural. I think there was also an earlier question that we missed about, would this kind of print have been given out for free?
Yes.
I think typically, but Britany, chime in if you think sometimes people did pay for them, because I think this type was used more for public announcements and they were just distributed. But I think there were other kinds of broadsides that people maybe didn't pay for.
Yeah, or it may not have been, handed out like a newspaper. It may have been like pasted up on a wall. That we do have for most of Posada is thought to have made 20,000 prints during his career, which is insane. And the fact that we have that many of his prints still exist in multiple copies suggests that at least some of them were collected in some way. So some of it, I mean, maybe some people eventually, my thought is that if they were free, people probably didn't value them as much and, thought of them as something to sit aside and wouldn't have had such an interest in preserving. But it's also totally possible that people, as people sort of embraced the style that he had, people worked more to build collections of his work and to preserve it. But I do know that it's just that this genre of print would often be hung up, or people would read it aloud in a public place, something like that.
Interesting. And actually, we have a question I think that relates to both, but expands upon this exact thing. That sort of has to do with the rarity. Do many of these ephemeral prints survive today, or how? Or are they now very rare? How rare are impressions of such prints today? Like, do you have any idea of the runs of either of these works? Is that hard to determine, or other works, by the artists that we do know the print run of, like how many were made? Britany?
Yeah, that's a great question. They're often with prints, often we have something we know. We have information on what it's called an edition. And if you're not familiar with printmaking, an edition is the total number of prints. So the prints exist in multiple, the artist made 10. 10 would be a pretty small run. So Posada, I would guess he's printing these things like in at least the hundreds. Ferrari probably was printing fewer, but I mean, they're both sort of appropriating non-traditional printmaking techniques, but doing them kind of for the opposite purpose. So Posada's trying to make as many as possible, while Ferrari is making them for his friends, basically. And so often the purpose that the print had, the thing that the artist is trying to do with the print will inform the size of the edition, whether the artist to be rare.
Yeah, it's almost like one is about wide access and the other is about almost a personal connection.
Right.
Which is very interesting.
Totally different kind of communication by both communication.
And I know we need to begin wrapping up, but one of the things I think, just to sort of maybe end on, is something I know both of us have, or we've all been sort of discussing and thinking about. Have you seen any, for example, right, both, as you mentioned, Britany, both Ferrari and Posada are really kind of taking advantage of the print medium, its multiplicity, its ability to make multiples, and also the distribution systems. Like Ferrari's using the mail to reach specific people. Posada's using that cheap newsprint and the lithograph to reach lots of people. What kinds of tools and platforms do artists, but also audiences, have at their disposal today? And have you experienced anything interesting, right, on any of these sort of platforms, right? Of what are the tools that we have, right? Have you seen anything? Britany first, and then Arielle, and then we'll wrap up.
Sure. I thought of a couple of things. So the first thing, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, they're both Posada and Ferrari are using sort of non-traditional printmaking techniques. And they're using them because it's what they have, what is available to them, what's accessible to them. And that question of sort of like working with what you have available to you in a particular moment reminded me of today how the Getty Museum in Los Angeles issued this challenge to everyone out there to recreate paintings from their collection using things that they had in their own home while they were quarantined. And I think we have a link to some of those images just so you'll be able to see a few of them yourself. But just that idea of, like working with what you have. And then it also reminded me there's a lot of artists working today with the internet and just like, the things that we use in a very utilitarian way every day with the internet to make art. And there's an artist that I especially liked named Corey Archangel, who uses everything from he hacks Super Mario Nintendo cartridges to make prints and videos, and he'll use there's an especially great piece where he's using cat videos from YouTube to line up with a piece of classical music. So I think you're seeing if you scroll down just a little bit on the site, you can see his Mario Cloud installation. So he's taken everything out of the game except for the clouds, and so it's like a totally different thing to look at with everything but the clouds missing. So yeah, those are just a few examples that come to mind for me.
Arielle, is there anything that you've seen that's particularly compelling in terms of these these distribution channels? Not new, but common ones.
Yeah,
the system of today.
Yeah. I mean, I think we definitely have much easier methods of communication with people, obviously, now with all of our internet access, as long as it's working. I've just been interested to see what contemporary artists are doing right now, whether it's just expressing how they feel about current events and what's going on, or people that are trying to use their artwork to raise awareness, to raise money, to help all the medical workers and, everybody that's working so hard right now. But I think, on platforms like Instagram, it's interesting to see what people are putting images of and what they're talking about.
Great. Well, I think we're going to wrap up now. I want to thank both you, Britany and Arielle, for everything. It was great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
And wonderful to have you to launch this with.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah,
appreciate it. Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Desktop Dialogues is going to happen every Wednesday at noon. Next Wednesday, we're going to have Associate Curator of Contemporary Art, Nadia Rivera-Fella, and Artistic Director for Community Arts, Robin Heinrich. Together, we're going to discuss how limitations helped artists like Louisa Joyner, Sanford Biggers, and Al Loving become resourceful and arrive at new creative solutions. If you'd like to watch this again, or share with a friend who missed out, feel free to check it out on the CMA's YouTube channel. It should be up sometime soon. Thanks again, and see you next week. Bye.